All right, today we'll go ahead and continue on with lesson 3. We're going to pick up where we left off. By nightfall, a green pine coffin stood on two sawhorses in the bay window of the front room, and people milled in the yard. They couldn't see Shotgun from there because the coffin lid blocked the view. Besides, a heavy gauze hung from the open lid and down over the front of the coffin to veil him, kind of like a sheer curtain. Shotgun hadn't been exactly fresh when they discovered his body. Grandma had flung open every window, but there was a peculiar smell in the room. I'd only had one look at him when they'd carried him in the coffin, and that was enough. I'll tell you just two things about him. He didn't have his teeth in, and he was wearing bib overalls. The people in the yard still couldn't believe Grandma was holding an open house. This didn't stop the reporter who was haunting the parlor looking for more flesh to add to his story, and it didn't stop Mrs. L. J. Weidenbach, the banker's wife, who came leading her father, an ancient codger himself, uh, half her size in full Civil War Union blue. "We are here to pay our respects at this sad time," Mrs. Weidenbach said when Grandma let them in. "When I told Daddy that Shotgun had been decorated by U.S. Grant and wounded 3 times at Bull Run, it brought it all back to him, and we had to come." Her old daddy wore a forage cap and a decoration from the Grand Army of the Republic, and he seemed to have no idea where he was. She led him up to the coffin where they admired the flowers. Grandma had planted a pitcher of glads from her garden at either end of the pine box. In each pitcher she'd stuck an American flag. A few more people willing to brave Grandma came and went, but finally we were down to the reporter, who'd settled in to the best chair, still nosing for news. Then who appeared at the front door but Mrs. Effie Wilcox in a hat. "Mrs. Dowdell, I've come to set you with you overnight and see our brave old soldier through his last watch." In those days people sat up with a corpse through the final night before burial. I'd have bet money Grandma wouldn't let Mrs. Wilcox in for a quick look, let alone overnight. But of course Grandma was putting on the best show possible to pull wool over the reporter's eyes. So in other words, she's trying to trick the reporter. Little though she seemed to think of townspeople, she thought less of strangers. So she didn't like the townspeople, but she didn't like the reporter even more. She didn't like him. Grandma waved Mrs. Wilcox inside, and in she came, her eyes all over the place. She made for the coffin, stared at the blank white gauze, and said, "Don't he look natural?" Then she drew up a chair next to the reporter. He flinched because he had it on good authority that she'd just been out of an insane asylum. Remember, that's the story Grandma made up. "Warm, ain't it?" she said straight at him, but looking everywhere. The crowd outside finally dispersed. Mary Alice and I hung on the edge of the room, too curious to be anywhere else. "If you're here for the long haul," Grandma said to the reporter, "how about a beer?" He looked encouraged, and Grandma left him to Mrs. Wilcox, which was meant as a punishment. She came back with 3 of her home brews, cellar cool. She brewed beer to drink herself, but these 3 bottles were to see the reporter through the night. She wouldn't have expected her worst enemy, Effie Wilcox, to drink alcohol in front of a man. In normal circumstances the family recalls stories about the departed to pass the long night hours, but these circumstances weren't normal, and quite a bit had already been recalled about Shotgun Cheatham anyway. Only a single lamp burned, and as midnight drew on, the glads, those are a type of flowers, drooped in their pitchers. I was wedged in a corner, beginning to doze, and Mary Alice was sound asleep on a throw rug. After the second beer the reporter lolled, like dozed, visions of Shotgun's Civil War glories no doubt dancing in his head. You could hear the tick of the kitchen clock. Grandma's chin would drop, then jerk back. Mrs. Wilcox had been humming Rock of Ages, but tapered off after Let Me Hide Myself in Thee. Then there was the quietest sound you ever heard, somewhere between a rustle and a whisper. It brought me around, and I saw Grandma sit forward and cock her head. I blinked to make sure I was awake, and the whole world seemed to listen. Not a leaf trembled outside. Oops, sorry, I forgot to turn the pages there. But the gauze that hung down over the open coffin moved, twitched. Except for Mary Alice, we all saw it. The reporter sat bolt upright, and Mrs. Wilcox made a little sound, and nothing. Then the gauze rippled as if a hand had passed across it from the other side, and in one place it wrinkled into a wad, as if somebody had snagged it, as if a feeble hand had reached up from the coffin depths in one last desperate attempt to live before the dirt was shoveled in. Every hair on my head stood up. "No," Mrs. Wilcox was strangling. She pulled back in her chair, and her hat went forward. "No." The reporter had his chair arms in a death grip. "Sweet mother!" But Grandma rocketed out of her chair. "Whoa, Shotgun!" she bellowed. "You had your time, boy. You don't get no more." She galloped out of the room faster than I could believe. The reporter was riveted, and Mrs. Wilcox was sinking fast. Quicker than it takes to tell, Grandma was back, and already raised to her apron shoulder was the 12-gauge Winchester from behind the woodbox. She swung it wildly around the room, skimming Mrs. Wilcox's hat, and took aim at the gauze that draped the yawning coffin. Then she squeezed off around. I thought that sound would bring the house down around us. I couldn't hear right for a week. Grandma roared out, "Rest in peace, you old—" Then she let fly with the other barrel. The reporter came out of the chair and whipped completely around in a circle. Beer bottles went everywhere. The straight route to the front door was in Grandma's line of fire, and he didn't have the presence of mind to realize she'd already discharged both barrels. In other words, she didn't have any more bullets. He went out the side window head first, leaving his hat and his notepad behind, which I think that's a funny part. I can picture him diving out of the window head first. Which he feared more, the living dead or Grandma's aim, he didn't tarry to tell. He didn't stick around to tell. Mrs. Wilcox was on her feet hollering, "The dead is walking, and Mrs. Dettle's gunning for me." She cut out and ran out the door and into the night. When the screen door snapped to behind her, silence fell. Mary Alice hadn't moved. The first explosion had blasted her awake, but she naturally thought that Grandma had killed her, so she didn't bother to budge. She says the whole experience gave her nightmares for years after. A burned powder haze hung in the room, cutting the smell of Shotgun Cheatham. The white gauze was black rags now, and Grandma had blown the lid clear off the coffin. She'd have blown out all 3 windows in the bay except for that they were open. As it was, she'd pitted her woodwork bad and topped the snowball bushes outside. But apart from scattered shot, she hadn't disfigured Shotgun Cheatham any more than he already was. Grandma stood there savoring the silence. Then she turned towards the kitchen, with the 12-gauge loose in her hand. "Time you kids was in bed," she said as she trudged past us. Apart from Grandma herself, I was the only one who'd seen her big old snaggle-toothed tomcat streak out of the coffin and over the window-sill when she lit fire. And I suppose she'd seen him climb in, which gave her ideas. It was the cat, sitting smug on Shotgun Cheatham's breathless chest, who'd batted at the gauze the way a cat will, and he sure lit out the way he'd come when Grandma fired just over his ragged ears, and he'd probably used up 8 lives already. The cat and the coffin gave Grandma Dowdle her chance. She didn't seem to have any time for Effie Wilcox, whose tongue flapped at both ends, but she had even less time for the newspaper reporters who think your business is theirs. Courtesy of the cat, she'd fired around, so to speak, in the direction of each. Though she didn't gloat, she looked satisfied. It certainly fleshed out her reputation and gave people new reason to leave her in peace. The story of Shotgun Cheatham's last night above ground kept the Coffee Pot Cafe fully engaged for the rest of our visit that summer. It was a story that grew in the telling, in one of those little towns where there's always time to ponder all the different kinds of truth. So it kind of became a tall tale. So really what was making that gauze move was the cat, right? The cat had climbed in under the gauze, was in the coffin, and Grandma saw it. Grandma knew all along that it was the cat, and she made up a story thinking, "Oh my gosh, it's the ghost," so that she could go get her gun and chase away Effie Wilcox and the news reporter. So she's kind of a smart lady there. All right, today's assignment. I want you to pick 4 characters, any 4 characters from that first chapter. So we've got Joey, Mary Alice, Grandma, Effie Wilcox, the reporter would be some good ones to pick from. And I want you to write down their name and then some of their character traits. What kind of person are they? Describe them, old, young, boy, girl. What do they maybe look like in your mind? Any important details that you know about them? Um, and that'll be our assignment for today. Next time, we'll start with The Mouse in the Milk when we start reading again in 1930.